Late evening at doctor's house, a night of unexpected terrors. It was a habit of the genial doctor, always the ever-curious mind, to drop by now and then for a chat with P.U.O., whose sharp intellect he deeply admired. The doctor, honest and unsuspecting to the very core, could not help but marvel at the talent of P.U.O., so distinct from his own. One early June evening, as the clock chimed 8:30, the doctor arrived and made himself comfortable, diving headfirst into a fascinating conversation about the shocking rise in arsenical poisonings linked to criminal activity. They were midway through the discussion when, without warning, the door to their sitting room flung open with a force that sent a cold shiver down their spines. A woman, frantic and breathless, burst in, her voice trembling. "Doctor, you're wanted!" Her voice, a chilling sound, made my heart leap in my chest. Who was this new visitor so desperate in her need? I recognized her immediately. Miss Ryder, the doctor's housekeeper, usually calm but now a whirlwind of panic. "What's happened?" I asked, concerned. "It was the telephone," she gasped. I answered it, and all I heard was a voice. "Help," it said. "Doctor, help, they've killed me." Her words faltered, fading into a haunting whisper. "Who spoke?" I asked, barely able to steady my own breath. It was just a whisper. "Ftin, something, Regent Court." The doctor's face paled. "Count Foscatini." His voice was thick with dread. "He has a flat there. I must go at once. What could have happened to him?" Puo, ever the one to follow the pulse of the moment, raised an eyebrow. "A patient of yours?" "Yes," replied the doctor, his gaze distant. "I treated him a few weeks ago. An Italian, but speaks English perfectly well." Without another word, we were out the door. "Let's not waste time," P.U.O. insisted. "I'll accompany you." The night air felt colder than ever as we hurried through the streets, finally catching a taxi after what seemed like an eternity of searching. Regent Court wasn't far, an upscale modern block of flats nestled just off St. John's Wood Road, gleaming with newness, yet holding an unsettling, silent aura. We arrived at the building and quickly ascended to the second floor. The lift attendant, visibly unsettled by our urgency, barely glanced at us before confirming that the Count had been dining with two foreign gentlemen just an hour before. "Were they alone?" I asked. "No," he replied, his eyes darting nervously. "There were two men with him. Foreign, I believe." At flat number 2, the doctor rang the bell repeatedly. No answer, just a haunting silence. The air was thick with tension. Something was wrong, something terrible. "This is getting serious," the doctor muttered under his breath. His voice edged with a sense of impending doom. "Is there a pass key to this flat?" he demanded, eyes locked on the attendant. The man nodded, scampering off to retrieve the key. Meanwhile, I felt the rising panic in the pit of my stomach. Could we be too late? Minutes later, the manager appeared, as pale as the rest of us. "I received a message from Count Foscatini." His voice trailed off, unable to say more. The flat door creaked open, revealing a scene that would haunt me forever. A small lounge greeted us first, an eerie stillness in the air. The dining room door stood ajar, and as we stepped inside, the grim reality hit us. A round table in the center bore the remnants of an interrupted meal. 3 chairs pushed back as though their occupants had vanished in haste. But it was the figure slumped over the writing desk that froze me in place. A man, or what had once been a man. His hand still gripped the base of the telephone, but his head was bent forward at an unnatural angle, a massive blow having struck him from behind. The weapon? A marble statuette, now stained with dark, ominous marks. The chilling silence hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play here, something that would unravel in ways we could not yet understand. The room was heavy with an unnerving stillness as the doctor bent over the lifeless body, his sharp gaze quickly taking in the scene. His voice was cold and clinical, almost detached, as he spoke. Stone dead must have been almost instantaneous. He paused, a frown crossing his features. I wonder how he even managed to phone us. The grim reality settled in, thick and suffocating. We shouldn't move him until the police arrive, the doctor advised, his tone final. On the manager's suggestion, we began our search of the flat, but it didn't take long to come to a chilling conclusion. This wasn't a crime scene where the murderer would linger. Whoever did this didn't need to hide. They could simply walk away, unnoticed. We returned to the dining room. Puo, who had not joined us in our search, was standing at the center table, his face a mask of concentration. He wasn't just looking, he was searching. I joined him, trying to make sense of what had captured his attention so fully. The table was a polished mahogany masterpiece, the centerpiece a bowl of roses that added an almost surreal beauty to the scene. Lace mats, white and pristine, lay like delicate whispers across the surface. A dish of fruit sat untouched, as did the 3 dessert plates, still waiting, uninvited to the mystery that had unfolded here. But it wasn't just the untouched food that caught my eye. There were 3 coffee cups, 2 black, 1 with milk, and all bearing traces of the coffee that had been hastily consumed. The decanter of port, half full, stood poised before the empty glasses, waiting. And then there was the cigar, the remains of 1. The ashes were still settling on the table, proof of one man's lingering indulgence. The others, cigarettes, burnt down to their last embers. It was all there, each clue adding to the eerie picture of a dinner interrupted by death itself. But despite my careful enumeration of these facts, something was missing. Something essential. I turned to Puo, confused by his intense focus. He wasn't looking at the surface details, the obvious signs of a dinner party gone awry. No, he was looking deeper, looking for a mistake. Mon ami, he said, his voice low, almost a murmur. You miss the point. I'm searching for something that isn't here, a mistake. Even the smallest of mistakes on the part of the murderer. His words trailed off, and I watched as he swiftly moved to the adjoining kitchen. There, he scanned the room, then shook his head. Murderers are rarely perfect. There's always something they overlook. Turning back to the manager, Puo pressed him. Explain to me your system of serving meals here. The manager stepped forward, his face betraying a hint of pride. It's quite simple, he said. This is the service lift. It runs to the kitchens at the top of the building. You order your meal through this telephone, and each course is sent down one at a time. The dirty dishes go back up the same way. No domestic fuss, no public restaurant. It's all discreet. Puo nodded, but there was no mistaking the spark in his eye. The plates and dishes from tonight, he pressed. Are they still in the kitchen? Certainly, the manager replied, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. Roberts, the lift man, can take you up. But I must warn you, with so many plates and dishes, they'll all be lumped together. You won't find anything that could help. But Puo was unmoved. His resolve was ironclad. Together, we ascended to the kitchens, where we questioned Roberts, the man who had taken the order from flat number 2. The order? Roberts said, his eyes flicking nervously. Yes, I remember. Soup julienne, sole meunière, roast beef, and a rice soufflé. It was for 3. What time? Puo asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of anticipation. Just about 8 o'clock. Robert's words hung in the air, charged with the electricity of an answer that felt like the beginning of something far darker than anyone could have imagined. The silent clue poison or murder? Ah, I see, Puo murmured, his voice trailing off as if the pieces were slowly falling into place. The plates, they've all been washed up by now. Yes, Roberts, the lift man, confirmed with a hint of regret. It's all been cleared. Unfortunate, Puo remarked, his tone contemplative, his mind clearly weaving a trail of thoughts. You were thinking about fingerprints, perhaps? He probed, turning to Roberts. Not exactly, Puo replied, his lips curling into an enigmatic smile. I am more interested in Count Foscatini's appetite. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Did he partake of every dish? Puo pressed, his gaze sharp and penetrating. Yes, but... The lift man hesitated. I can't say how much he ate. The plates were soiled and the dishes emptied, except for the rice soufflé. There was still a fair amount of that left. Ah, Puo's expression shifted slightly, his satisfaction palpable. His eyes gleamed as though he had just uncovered a secret. Interesting, he murmured under his breath. As we descended back into the flat, Puo's voice softened, becoming almost a whisper. We are clearly dealing with a man of method. I raised an eyebrow. Do you mean the murderer? Or Count Foscatini? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. Puo's response was calm, measured. Count Foscatini was undoubtedly a man of order, even in the face of death. After pleading for help and announcing his impending demise, he carefully hung up the telephone receiver. A meticulous act, if you ask me. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the pieces of the puzzle start to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. You suspect poison? I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. Puo did not answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the still form of the Count, as though reading the faintest whispers of the past. The blow to the head, he said softly, was a mere blind. A distraction. I could hardly believe my ears. Puo's theory was bold, his certainty unnerving. My thoughts swirled, caught between the possibility of a slow-acting poison and the sudden violence of a physical strike. How could one man create such a carefully crafted illusion of death? Before I could ask another question, we were interrupted by the arrival of the local police inspector, flanked by 2 constables. He cast a reluctant glance in our direction, his eyebrows knit in suspicion. Puo, ever the diplomat, stepped forward with an air of calm authority. We are friends of Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard, Puo announced smoothly, offering just enough weight in his words to diffuse the tension. The inspector's reluctance melted away, and we were grudgingly allowed to remain. It was just a few minutes before we were interrupted once again. The door swung open, and in rushed a middle-aged man, his face a mask of grief and panic. He looked utterly shaken, as if the weight of his distress could barely be contained. I must speak to you, he cried, his voice thick with emotion. I'm Graves, Count Foscatini's butler. It's terrible. His words were as ominous as his arrival. What could be worse than the body we'd just discovered? Graves' story promised to unlock more layers of this dark enigma. He explained that on the previous morning, 2 Italian men had visited the Count. 2 men whose presence had set off a chain of events that led to the death we had just witnessed. Who were they? Asked, his voice low, his eyes narrowing as if he already suspected the answer. The butler hesitated for a moment before answering. They were Italians, but the elder one, a man about 40. His voice faltered. He could barely find the words to describe what had unfolded. There was a weight in his tone that suggested more than just a casual visit. but the moment was broken. Puo's eyes flicked to the butler, and he remained as calm as ever. "And what happened after their visit, Graves?" Puo asked, leaning in slightly, his posture casual but his mind racing. Every word from the butler now held the potential to unravel the mystery, but we could all sense something more was at play, something sinister, something that could only be revealed piece by piece, like a puzzle whose pieces were deliberately hidden. I could feel the tension in the room, the air thick with the sense of an impending revelation. Every detail mattered now. Every word could be the key to unlocking the truth behind the Count's death. Was it poison? Was it a well-executed murder? And who were these mysterious Italians? As Graves continued, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the truth was far darker than any of us could yet comprehend. The butler, Graves, gave a name, Signor Asano. The man, a well-dressed young Italian of about 24, had arrived with a certain air of confidence. Count Foscatini, it seemed, had been prepared for their visit. With a casual ease, he had immediately sent Graves on a trivial errand, a move that struck the butler as odd. As Graves hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and curiosity, he admitted, "I stayed, trying to overhear something, but the conversation was too low, too guarded. All I could make out was that it was something to do with money, and a threat. It wasn't a pleasant exchange. A chill ran through the room as Graves continued. The Count, seemingly losing his patience, raised his voice just enough for the butler to hear the chilling words. "I have no time to argue further, gentlemen. If you will dine with me tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, we will resume our discussion." Graves, realizing he might be caught eavesdropping, had hurriedly left to fulfill his errand, never guessing the deadly fate that awaited his master. The two men, as it turned out, had arrived on time, exactly at 8 o'clock. The evening passed with a strange calm, during which they spoke of trivial matters: politics, the weather, the theater, a facade, a mask hiding the sinister intentions lurking beneath. When Graves returned, bearing the port and the coffee, the Count had dismissed him, telling him he was free for the night. "Is this usual?" the inspector asked, raising an eyebrow. "No, sir," Graves replied quickly. "That's what made me think it must have been something important, something unusual." The butler's tone grew grim. After his dismissal, he had left at about 8:30, meeting a friend and heading to the Metropolitan Music Hall. When he returned, he found no trace of the men. The Count was dead. Murdered. The time of death? It was pinned down by a small clock on the writing table that had been knocked off, its hands frozen at 8:47. The same time the Count's last words were broadcast over the telephone to Miss Ryder. It all pointed to a carefully orchestrated crime, but how did it unfold? The police surgeon had finished his examination, and there, lying on the couch, was the Count. His olive complexion was eerily still, his sharp nose and full lips drawn back in a permanent grimace. His face, unsettling, almost haunting in its beauty, spoke of a life now extinguished. The inspector, his notebook now closed, ran a hand through his hair. "This seems clear enough," he muttered. "The only question is, where is this Signor Asano? His address might be in the Count's pocketbook." It was Puo who had noticed something most had missed. As he scanned the neatly arranged room, his gaze landed on a small, precise inscription in the Count's handwriting. "Signor Pao Asano, Groen Hotel." The inspector made a quick call. "Just in time," he said, his grin widening. "Our fine gentleman is off to catch the boat train to the coast. We'll have him in no time." The case, it seemed, was on the verge of closure. A simple vendetta, perhaps. A routine murder in the world of Italian retribution. The inspector didn't seem to care much for the details. his mind already moving on to the next case. But PUO was different. His thoughts were far from settled. As we made our way down the stairs, the tension was palpable. Dr. Hawker, ever the enthusiast, couldn't contain his excitement. "Quite the story, isn't it?" he exclaimed. "You wouldn't believe it if you read it in a novel." But PUO said nothing. His mind was elsewhere, locked in the silent grip of something deeper. The case, to him, wasn't so simple. He hadn't spoken much since we arrived, and now, as we reached the bottom of the stairs, his expression remained unreadable. Hawker, unable to resist, clapped PUO on the back. "What do you think, Master Detective? Got it all figured out?" But PUO's response was far from what I expected. "There's something odd," he said, his eyes distant. "For example, the window." The inspector, distracted, turned to PUO. "But it was fastened. No one could have gotten out that way." PUO nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "Exactly. No one could have gotten out, but someone had to have come in." The words hit like a bolt of lightning. My mind raced. The window. It had been sealed. There was no other way into the room, unless the killer was still inside. A deeper truth was emerging. But what was it? And who exactly was Senor Asano? Was he just a pawn in this elaborate game of life and death, or was he the mastermind behind it all? We were standing on the precipice of something far darker than anyone had realized. The evening was far from over, and PUO's silent resolve suggested that the truth was slipping just beyond our grasp. Could the murderer still be within these walls, or had the real mystery only just begun? The doctor's puzzled expression deepened as PUO's words lingered in the air. "But why were you able to notice it?" he asked, clearly at a loss. PUO, unfazed by the confusion, leaned in closer with a measured calmness, his eyes alight with something I couldn't quite place. "It is the curtains I refer to," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "They were not drawn, and that is strange. Why would they remain open, especially given the hour?" The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of PUO's observation settling over us like a thick fog. I could see the doctor's brow furrow in confusion, still grappling with the idea. PUO continued, his voice unwavering. "And then there was the coffee. Very black coffee, you see." "Coffee?" the doctor repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What about it?" "Very black," PUO reiterated. "You see, when you pair that with the fact that very little of the rice soul was eaten, we begin to get something more than mere coincidence." I looked between PUO and the doctor, sensing the tension rise in the air. The doctor's face twisted in disbelief. "Moonshine?" he laughed, shaking his head. "You're pulling my leg, aren't you?" "Never do I pull anyone's leg," PUO responded, his tone cutting through the laughter with precision. He turned to me, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Hastings here knows that I am perfectly serious." The doctor seemed taken aback, his skepticism lingering in the air like smoke. "So, you suspect the manservant, that he was in on it, slipped something into the coffee?" PUO's lips curled into a faint smile. "Perhaps, my friend, but it is not the servant who interests me. It is Senor Asano whose alibi I find troubling." "You think he has an alibi?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "That is precisely what worries me," PUO replied, his voice low and deliberate. "I have no doubt we will soon be enlightened on that point." It was only a matter of hours before the events took a dramatic turn. The morning headlines, published in the Daily News, announced the arrest of Senor Asano, charged with the murder of Count Foscatini. When the authorities apprehended him, Asano denied any knowledge of the Count. He claimed to have never even set foot near Regent's Court, neither on the evening of the crime nor the previous morning. A sense of unease settled over the room. It wasn't just Asano's denial that raised suspicion, but the disappearance of the younger man who had accompanied him. The second man, who had once been at the center of the investigation, seemed to have vanished without a trace. Asano, however, remained calm. He had arrived alone at the Grova Hotel 2 days before the murder. Despite all efforts, the authorities couldn't trace the whereabouts of the mysterious younger man, leaving a gaping hole in the case. But then, in a twist no one had anticipated, the Italian ambassador himself appeared at the police court proceedings. He testified under oath that Senor Asano had been with him at the embassy from 8 to 9 that evening. As a result, the prisoner was discharged, his alibi seemingly solid. The case, at least to the public, seemed closed. Many people assumed it was some kind of political vendetta, a crime being deliberately hushed up by higher powers. Yet, Puo, ever the keen observer, took a different view. He had been following every development with intense interest, his mind working overtime. I wasn't prepared, however, for what he said next. One morning, out of the blue, Puo turned to me with a strange glint in his eye. "Hastings," he said, "I'm expecting a visitor at 11 o'clock today." And that visitor is none other than Senor Asano himself. I blinked, utterly shocked. "Asano?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "But why? What could he want?" Puo's lips curled into a mysterious smile. "That, my friend, is exactly what we are about to discover." The day passed slowly, the hours dragging on like a slowly unfolding mystery. At 11 o'clock sharp, there was a knock at the door. I held my breath as Puo rose, his steps measured, his mind already racing ahead. The door opened, and in walked Senor Asano, a small, thin man with dark eyes that darted around the room like a trapped animal. His presence seemed to fill the room with an odd tension, one that I couldn't explain. Asano's gaze flicked from Puo to me, his eyes quickly moving from one corner of the room to the other. He was clearly nervous, his body language giving away his unease. "Senor Poirot," he said, his voice low and guarded, "I have come to consult you." Puo, unfazed by the man's anxiety, simply tapped himself lightly on the chest and gestured to the chair across from him. "Be seated, senor," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "You received my note?" Asano hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he took a seat. His furtive glances never ceased, his every move suggesting that he was trying to hide something or someone. The air around us thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. What was he here to say? Was this another move in a game too dangerous for us to fully comprehend? And what, I wondered, was he hiding? "I'm determined to get to the bottom of this mystery," Puo declared, his voice sharp and commanding. "In some small measure you can aid me, senor. Let us commence. You, in company with a friend, visited the late Count Foscatini on the morning of Tuesday the 9th, did you not?" Senor Asano, his face taut with tension, raised a hand, his expression darkening. "I did nothing of the sort," he snapped, his words filled with an anger that seemed to boil just beneath the surface. "I swear it in court." Puo's eyes gleamed with a quiet certainty as he leaned forward. "Ah, but I have a little idea, and I suspect you have sworn falsely." "You threaten me?" Asano hissed, his eyes narrowing in defiance. "I have nothing to fear from you." "Exactly," Puo said, his tone unyielding. "And as I am not an imbecile, it is not with the gallows that I threaten you, senor, but with publicity." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Asano visibly recoiled, his face paling. "Publicity," he repeated under his breath, the word sounding like a curse. His discomfort was palpable. It was clear that the mere mention of it struck a nerve deep within him. Puo watched him closely, a slight smile playing at the edges of his lips. "I had a feeling you wouldn't like that word," Puo continued, his voice laced with quiet satisfaction. "My little ideas, you know, they are very valuable to me." He paused, his eyes piercing through the tension that hung in the room. "Come, senor. Your only chance is to be frank with me. I do not ask to know whose indiscretions brought you to England. I know this much. You came for the special purpose of seeing Count Foscatini." The Italian man let out a growl, his voice rough and defensive. "He was not a count," he spat. "I've already noted that his name does not appear in the Almanac de Goa." Puo's expression remained unchanged, his voice low but insistent. "Never mind the title. The title of Count is often useful in the profession of blackmailing." Asano shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Puo's piercing gaze never wavered as he continued. "I suppose I might as well be frank now. You seem to know a good deal, Senor Asano." The room was still as Puo's words hit the mark. Asano's hands trembled slightly, but he was cornered. He could feel the weight of Puo's deduction bearing down on him. "I visited the dead man on Tuesday morning, yes. That much is true," Asano admitted reluctantly, his voice thick with unease. "But I never went there on the following evening. There was no need. I will tell you everything." There was a strange flicker in his eyes as he began to speak again. Certain information concerning a man of great position in Italy had come into this scoundrel's possession. He demanded a large sum of money in exchange for the papers. I came over to England to settle the matter. I called upon him that morning by appointment. Puo's eyes never left Asano's face, his mind working swiftly to piece together the puzzle. "And the money?" Puo asked, his voice calm but precise. "It was paid," Asano said quickly, "in Italian notes of comparatively small denominations." "Small denominations?" Puo repeated, his voice dropping lower. "How was it paid, senor?" Asano shifted uncomfortably but answered, "I paid the money over to him there and then." In exchange, he handed me the incriminating papers. "And you never saw him again?" Puo inquired, his voice steady. "No," Asano replied, his eyes darkening. "I never saw him again after that." Puo nodded, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair. "And why did you not say all this when you were arrested?" Asano's gaze flickered uneasily. "In my delicate position, I was forced to deny any association with the man. I had no choice." Puo's eyes gleamed as he absorbed the information, his mind working faster than I could follow. "And how do you account for the events of the evening, then?" he asked, his voice unwavering. Asano's expression darkened, his brow furrowing deeply. "I can only think that someone must have deliberately impersonated me that evening." Puo raised an eyebrow. "I understand that no money was found in the flat, senor." Asano hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to the floor. He seemed to be calculating something in his mind before finally muttering, "No, there was no money." The silence that followed was deafening. Puo studied Asano with an inscrutable gaze, the wheels turning in his mind at a pace that was almost imperceptible. He tapped his fingers against the armrest again, his voice soft but tinged with an almost amused finality. "Strange," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "We all have the little gray cells, and so few of us know how to use them." He stood up, the tension in the room hanging thick around us. "Good morning, Senor Asano," Puo said as he bowed his guest out. "I believe your story. It is very much as I had imagined, but I had to make sure." As the door closed behind the Italian, I stood still, a chill running down my spine. Puo had not simply been fishing for information, he had already known the truth. Asano's confession was just a formality, a final piece in a puzzle Puo had already solved. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous. The revelation Puo returned to his armchair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He turned to me, his eyes glinting with that familiar gleam of certainty. "Let us hear more, Hastings," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "The case, what do you make of it?" I paused, trying to gather my thoughts, still grappling with the confusing twists and turns of the investigation. "Well, I suppose Asano is right," I said, frowning. "Someone must have impersonated him. That much makes sense." Puo shook his head slowly, a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "Never, Hastings, never will you use the brains the good God has given you. Recall, if you will, something I said after we left the flat that night." I leaned forward, trying to focus. Puo continued, his voice soft but forceful. "I referred to the window curtains not being drawn. We are in the month of June, remember? It's still light at 8 p.m., but by 1:30 the light is already beginning to fade. Yet the curtains remained open. What does that tell us, Hastings?" A flicker of realization crossed my mind, but Puo wasn't finished. He pressed on, relentlessly. "The coffee," he continued, his tone deepening. "It was very black. Count Foscatini's teeth were magnificently white, but coffee stains the teeth. Now, tell me, Hastings, why then was there coffee in all 3 cups?" I shook my head, utterly bewildered. I don't understand. Why would anyone pretend that Count Foscatini had drunk coffee when he hadn't? Puo leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair. "I will help you, Hastings. You see, there is a curious absence of evidence. No one saw Asano or his supposed companion arrive at the flat. No one saw them leave. All we have are the remnants of a meal, plates, forks, knives, and a host of other inanimate objects. And yet, they tell us a story." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You mean the dinner?" "Ah, yes," Puo said with a sharp nod. "Graves, the thief, the scoundrel. But what a man of method he is. He overhears a portion of the conversation that morning, enough to realize that Asano will be in a difficult position to defend himself. So, later that evening, around 8 p.m., he tells his master that there's a phone call for him. Count Foscatini stretches out to answer the phone, but from behind Graves strikes him down with a marble figure. My heart raced as Puo's voice remained calm, almost clinical in its precision. Quickly, Graves arranges dinner for 3, setting the table, dirties the plates, the knives, the forks. But then, I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as though the truth was just out of reach. "Then," Puo continued, his voice dark and heavy with the weight of what was to come, "he eats, but not just a small meal. No, he devours 3 portions of risotto, and then the rice sulfur. Too much for him. He even smokes a cigar and 2 cigarettes to help carry the illusion." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was all a setup? Magnificently thorough. Puo confirmed, his voice cool and composed. Then, having moved the hands of the clock to 8:47, Graves smashes it, stops it. But there's one thing he doesn't do. He doesn't draw the curtains. The implications were beginning to sink in, but Puo wasn't finished yet. If there had been a real dinner party, the curtains would have been drawn as soon as the light began to fail, but they were left open. A small detail, Hastings, yet one that makes all the difference. And then Graves hurries out, mentioning the guests to the lift man as he passes. He rushes to a phone booth, rings the doctor at exactly 8:47, just in time to report his master's dying cry. I leaned back, stunned by the unfolding complexity of the plan. But no one ever questioned the call from Flat 2 at that time. "Ah, Hastings," Pihuo said with a smile that held more than a hint of satisfaction. Not even Hercule Poirot himself would have suspected that. But I was about to inquire, now that I have proven my point. I sat in silence, my mind racing to piece together the final details. "And then, my friend," Pihuo added, "when the truth is revealed, we'll see to it that the respectable Graves is arrested. I wonder how much of the money he's spent." I shook my head, both in awe and frustration. "You were right all along. You always are. Confound you, Poirot." Pihuo merely smiled, his eyes twinkling with the quiet pride of a mind that had already solved the case. "Indeed, Hastings. And that is how the puzzle is solved." This conclusion leaves the audience with a sense of satisfaction, yet lingering curiosity. Graves' meticulous plan and its unraveling in Poirot's hands are revealed in an almost eerie, methodical way, inviting the listeners to ponder the depths of the mystery long after the final word is spoken.